So let's talk about the fun new way to play games of Warhammer 40k. If you want some different varied games with a little bit less bookkeeping, then maybe these Tempest of War cards might be for you. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about an interesting little Games Workshop card deck that went on pre-order last weekend and is going to be available to buy on the 2nd of April. I thought they'd be worth talking about, as I do think that these will be really quite popular. They feel like quite a quick and punchy way of starting a game, particularly with a little bit less decision paralysis due to secondaries and less emphasis on building your army to achieving certain ones. These Tempest of War cards are a 66 card deck and basically a quick and simple way to play Warhammer 40k aimed at matched play with points, though I don't see why you couldn't use them as power level if you so wished to. I feel in general they're quite a good middle ground between the different ways to play 40k. In general, Games Workshop tends to be either quite focused on the really high-end matched tournament play, with relatively complicated secondaries and missions and things, and then not really much of a gap between that and narrative play, where they encourage the use of power levels. I feel there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect where a lot of people play with points but don't necessarily keep up with the latest tournament pack. I guess the Eternal War missions from the book do kind of work fine, but I feel that these cards will add quite a lot of variety and will be quite well tailored to that niche. Essentially what they boil down to is still a primary mission where you're largely fighting over objectives, but then instead of the secondaries, you kind of have Maelstrom of War cards from 8th edition, the cards that you draw and you have to try and achieve certain objectives, so your army has to be ready to react to new orders as the game goes on. First I thought we'd talk about how they work, and then just give some overall opinions, but in general I do feel that these are quite good, and I think that they're going to be popular. In general, if you're wanting to play with these, they're generally aimed at either incursion or strike force games, so typically 1,000 points or 2,000 points. You get your armies together as normal, and they do have included the latest version of the detachment rules, so things like super heavy auxiliaries only cost 1 command point if they're the same faction as your warlord, for example. It basically has a small rules leaflet in the box for getting a game going, and telling you how the cards work. The general idea is that you randomly determine the mission with cards, a deployment deck to see where your armies are going to be setting up, a mission special rule deck, which puts a bit of a twist on the mission, maybe manipulating the way that you'd use strategic reserves or command points or something, and then a primary mission deck, usually largely focused on objectives, but they often have a few twists. Then they have 2 decks of secondary missions included. They're basically the Maelstrom card set, and they're the ones that you draw and try and achieve throughout the game. They've got 2 decks, one for each player. To go through the setting up the game process, you basically have to randomly draw one of each of these 3 cards. First up, you have a deployment card. There's 6 to choose from, all of them fairly standardized map layouts. They mark out drop zones that vary depending on mission size, so you wind up setting up a little bit closer to each other if you're playing incursion, but you're quite far away on strike force. They're really quite simple and easy to follow, but they don't mark out any objectives or things. They're placed by the players later on, as we'll see in the primary mission. Then, after you've got your deployment zone down, you pick one of these mission rule cards. These basically put a twist on the mission. They give you a special rule that applies to both armies and might make certain aspects of the game either harder or easier. There's 12 different ones to choose from, including one being this Dodd one here, which basically gives you no mission special rule. And most of them I think aren't going to enormously change the game, but might make you just make a few key decisions a bit differently. Here are just a few of the more interesting examples. There's one called Secret Intel, where you only get your command points if your warlord's on the battlefield. That one might make you think twice about throwing your warlord to his death early in the game. There's a Scramblers one, where you can't either set up on an objective marker in no man's land, or arrive directly onto it via reserve, so it means that you'll actually have to move onto it on the board. Hidden Supplies means that each player sets up one additional objective marker, meaning that you'll have a serious amount of those on the board. Warp Lightning Storm has the chance to deal some mortal wounds to your own models in your psychic phase, a 1 out of 6 chance to take 1 mortal wound per unit on objective marker. Maybe not often going to be the biggest deal, but if you're trying to hold an objective with a 1 wound infantry, that could be scary. There's Tactical Reserves, halving the CP cost to put units in strategic reserve. Vox Static for command point rerolls costing double the amount, so it would cost a bit extra to pay to smooth out the odds and reroll key charges, for example. And then Sweep and Clear, one where the objective remains under your control even if you move off it, unless your opponent can put a unit there. Overall, just generally quite small things to shake up the game and the way it's played, but maybe not so enormously powerful that it's really going to skew the outcome of a game. Most of the time I think that these aren't going to massively advantage one player over another. Then, following that, you draw one of the primary missions. All of these do basically revolve around taking at least some objectives, but most of them have something additional as well. The way that objective markers work in these missions is that you get 4 objective markers in Incursion or 5 in Strike Force. You each deploy 1 in your deployment zone, then alternate to put them down in the midfield, greater than 6 inches away from a board edge or another objective marker. For the most part, I think that seems quite sensible. You'll have one very safe marker, one that's a little bit easier to get. I think the only slight thing that is a bit of a negative about the objective markers is that you always have to start placing them with the youngest player first, which means that if you're playing a Strike Force game, it means that basically the youngest player is always going to have 2 very easy objectives, and the older player is just going to have the one. I guess the theory might be to reward a less experienced player with an easier game, but to be honest, there's not really any guarantee that the younger player is going to be less experienced, and it just seems a bit weird to create that kind of skew like that. I can't help but think a better solution might have been to make the final objective just in the centre of the board for Strike Force games, or just to roll off to see who places it. I just feel that in Strike Force it's often going to mean that one player is just going to have really quite a big uphill struggle. In any case, that minor gripe aside, the primary missions all look fairly interesting. There's the standard take and hold one for hold 1 objective, hold 2 objectives, and hold more, scored at the end of your command phase as normal. Direct assault, where they cost 4 victory points, but you have the option to gain more victory points for either taking an enemy's objective or killing them off it. Priority targets allows you to score a bunch of points for holding objectives at the end of the game, maybe slightly rewarding people who can either jump on the objectives at the end of the game or can just wipe out their opponent's army by the end. Vital Ground encourages you to push forward. You get 3 victory points for your home objective, 4 for at least one middle one, and 5 if you manage to take the enemy's home field one. Plus, with that one, you can score up to 3 victory points for killing enemy units as well. Burn and Raise is hold 1, hold more, and 5 victory points for an action to get rid of an objective. And Claim the Battlefield is another action related one, where you can do an action with either infantry or OBSEC units to claim an objective, and then if you continue to score claimed objectives, they give you plus 2 victory points per one. Generally, the main thrust of them is that you still want to be standing on more points than your opponents, but a bit of variation is quite nice, and it might give you some other things to think about. Then, instead of the slightly fiddly secondary objectives from the Grand Tournament pack, you don't have to worry about choosing those at the start of the game. Instead, you basically draw these cards as you go on, most of the objectives scoring you 5 victory points, and you can score up to 45 points from them throughout the entire game, so you can't just run off and win just based on these cards alone. You do need to be doing the primary objective as well. These cards are basically very similar to the Maelstrom cards in 8th edition, though I think that they're massively more thought through. In 8th edition, there was just really quite a lot of cards that asked you to go and score objectives that were miles away, or kill units in your opponent's army that they don't even have. There's still likely to be a fair few of these ones that are duds, but seeing as you should be able to get through most of the pack in any one game, it just removes the variance a bit. And I'd say that the majority of them do seem somewhat hard, but also going to be achievable against quite a few armies. Basically, the way that they work is that you start the game by drawing 3 of these cards, each player drawing from their own deck of 20. If you particularly think that one's going to be very unachievable, or you just don't like it, you can spend 1 command point to swap one of them out at the end of the command phase. You then basically try and achieve the card's objectives over the course of your turn. Any ones that you score immediately, and they usually give you 5 victory points each. Then at the end of each of your turns, if you've got any left that you don't think you're going to be able to do, you can discard them if you like, ready to draw a new one at the start of your own next command phase. It means that between discarding and also that command point, you will have a good chance to get through most of them if you want to, so maybe drawing bad ones doesn't have quite as bad an effect as it might have had in previous editions of Maelstrom. As mentioned, there's 20 cards in total. Here are just a few tasters of them. A fair few of the kill ones tend to be ones where you keep a kill tally until you've reached that goal. You don't have to kill them within one turn or anything. For example, Blood and Guts happens when you've wiped out 2 units in melee or 3 units in strike force, or No Prisoners gets you 5 victory points when you've killed 15 models, or 30 in strike force. Both of those do seem doable, but they're a little bit dependent on what you're playing and what your opponent's playing. There's then Behind Enemy Lines, 5 victory points if you can get 2 non-aircraft units into your enemy's deployment zone. Secure No Man's Land for taking 2 objectives in the midfield. And No Retreat, No Surrender, 5 victory points if you manage to not fall back, don't fail morale, and you don't move off any objective markers. Maybe a little bit similar to things like Oaths of Moment for the Space Marines. I think for the most part a lot of these will be quite challenging to achieve. I'd not really be expecting to clear up the entire hand of 3 of them every single turn, though I think maybe some of the movement ones do perhaps favour the more mobile armies out there. who I think would have a bit more of an easy time with these kind of cards. In general, though, these are just so much better than the previous edition's Maelstrom cards, where a lot of them just gave you a lot of victory points really for not that much effort at all, and a lot of them were either just completely unachievable or just really unlikely to happen. So overall, I must admit I'm really quite positive about this deck. It adds a fair bit of variety and a little bit of random fun factor that you don't really know what you're going to get when you turn up to a game of it. But in general, I don't think that the random factor takes away so much that it's going to massively skew the game just on basis of random chance. I think perhaps one of the biggest advantages is essentially replacing the secondary missions with a much more quicker and intuitive system. Admittedly less balanced, I think, for top tournament play. It certainly opens you up to an element of luck depending on when you draw certain cards, but I still think that quite a lot of people will be a fan of them. The normal secondary mission mechanic is something that I've seen a fair bit of criticism for in 9th edition, maybe one that's aimed a little bit more at tournament players, and can just seem like a bit of a drag in more casual games. In general, for things I like about it, I do quite like the way that it looks very quick to start, the missions are all quite simple and easy to understand, and I think it's quite handy just to have those 3 cards out on the battlefield so that either player can review what they're doing at all times, rather than having to flick back to certain pages in the book. You don't have to be looking up tables of secondary objectives each time you play, and I think it will add up to a fair bit less bookkeeping. You can just keep account of the cards that you've managed to score throughout the game and add them up at the end if you want to. It'll add some fun variety as well. You don't have to be stuck to the individual missions in the book. You might get a few interesting combos of different special rules, objectives, and mission deployments. I'm sure some will work a bit better than others, but for the most part, I can see most combos of these working out pretty well. As for the Maelstrom cards themselves, I must admit I do quite like them. They do feel quite fun and punchy in game. Basically playing a mini game with the objectives, can you get the ones that you want, and which sort of ones should you try and commit to achieving, or is it better just to focus on destroying the enemy army and focusing on the primaries, or even trying to deny your opponents from scoring their own cards? I really enjoyed Maelstrom of War in 8th edition, I'll admit, and this just seems like a version of it that's just better executed. As for criticisms and downsides, I must admit that youngest player getting an advantage is a bit weird. It just seems like a slightly odd arbitrary swing, where you might be playing with 2 people where the younger player is actually vastly more experienced at playing Warhammer, and they really don't need an advantage like that. I think if I was playing these cards and I wound up being the younger player, I'd offer just to put the last objective in the centre of the board, just to make for a slightly more balanced game. The other main criticism is that Maelstrom cards are going to be a bit more random. I think in the vast majority of games, they're still going to reflect the person who's generally dominating the field and beating their opponent. They are generally likely to score more, but just every so often, the order of drawing the cards is going to be a big deal. Just as an example, say if you drew that behind enemy lines turn 1 and you couldn't score it, and then you draw a lot of the killing ones very late in the game, perhaps when the cards are still technically doable, but it might just be a lot harder to achieve. I guess in theory the twists might hinder one player a bit more than the other as well. Say if you're an army that really needs those command point rerolls for deep strike charges, that's going to hurt a bit. But I think in general both the twist and the Maelstrom cards just seem a lot better thought through than 8th, and I think that the majority of armies should get on relatively well with both. Overall, I am looking forward to getting in a few games with these. They just seem like a really fun game mode for 40k. You could certainly smash some de-optimized armies against each other with this, and I still think it'd be fun to play with fairly optimized competitive armies trying to outdo each other. It certainly make the game a little bit more random, but also quite fun and engaging at the same time. Maybe good for a couple of people who enjoy playing competitively, but just want to try out some ideas for armies rather than practicing for any one given tournament. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you like these cards? Do you think that you could see yourself using them in 40k in the future? Looking forward to whether or not you think that these are good for the game. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can support, which is my Element Games affiliate link down in the video description. Element Games is a UK-based discount retailer. They usually give 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and if you do buy anything from them, they usually give a 10 to 20% discount off them, so it can be a good way to save money, at least within the UK. If you click the link before buying anything, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more, so it can be a way to help out the channel on things that you were thinking about picking up anyway. I'm sure they'll have these Tempest of War cards once they're out. For people over in the USA, I do also have an Amazon link down there as well. Again, that works basically the same. Click the link, buy literally anything off Amazon, and a small amount goes to help support the channel without costing you any more. again can be a way to help out on things that you were thinking about buying anyway. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.